Katreena Kaif had seen more hardships in her young life than most people twice her age. Since her father's death, the entire weight of her family's survival had fallen on her fragile shoulders. Every morning she worked tirelessly as an assistant in a large corporate office, and every night she wrote freelance articles to earn a few extra dollars. Writing wasn't just a way to earn money for her, it was her only escape, the one place where her heart could finally speak. She carried a little diary everywhere she went. To others, it was just an old notebook. But to Katreena, it was her world. In those pages, she poured every secret, every fear, every broken dream. When she was too tired to speak, her pen spoke for her. That diary knew her better than anyone else ever could. The CEO of the company, Anderson, was known for his strict nature. Employees whispered about him in hushed voices, always fearful of making even the smallest mistake. He had a commanding presence, the kind that made people lower their eyes when he entered a room. To them he was cold, untouchable, and merciless. What no one knew, however, was that Anderson carried wounds of his own, buried so deeply that not even he dared to confront them. One morning, in her usual rush to get to work on time, Katreena accidentally dropped her diary near the conference room. She had no idea that the little book, her heart and soul, was now lying vulnerable in the middle of her workplace. Later that afternoon, Anderson entered the conference room for a meeting. As he placed his briefcase on the table, his eyes caught a glimpse of the small diary lying there. At first, he thought it was just some employee's notes. Almost carelessly, he picked it up and flipped it open. But the moment his eyes landed on the first page, something shifted inside him. The words weren't simple notes or schedules. They were pieces of a young woman's soul. As he read, Anderson's sharp, stern expression softened. Each line carried raw pain, stories of a struggling family, a sick mother, nights spent hungry, mornings spent pretending to smile. Katreena's handwriting trembled on some pages, as if the tears that fell while writing had blurred the ink. The first time in years, Anderson felt as though he wasn't the CEO in charge of hundreds of employees, but simply a man reading another human being's cry for help. The office around him faded away as he turned page after page, unable to stop. And then, he reached the final line. The words hit him like a thunderbolt. His hand froze, his heartbeat quickened, and for a moment it felt as though the ground had slipped from beneath his feet. With the diary clutched tightly in his hands, Anderson left the conference room without a word. Meanwhile, Katreena had no idea that her deepest secrets were no longer hidden. They were now in the hands of the most powerful man in her world. Anderson walked into his private office with heavy steps, the diary pressed tightly against his chest, as if it carried something far more valuable than paper and ink. He locked the door behind him and sat down at his polished wooden desk. For a long moment, he just stared at the little book, his mind replaying the last line he had read. If tomorrow doesn't come for me, at least I'll know I tried. Even if nobody ever noticed. The words haunted him. They weren't just sad. They were desperate. A cry that could only come from someone standing at the edge of life itself. Anderson leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, unsettled in a way he hadn't been for years. For a man who built his empire on control and discipline, losing his composure was rare. But now he couldn't shake the thought, who was this girl? Which one of his employees had been carrying such unbearable pain silently every day right under his nose? At that very moment, Katreena was in her small cubicle on the other side of the office, nervously typing away at documents. She hadn't realized yet that her diary was missing. Her mind was on the electricity bill waiting at home, her mother's, medication, and the fear that she might not have enough money this month. She smiled faintly at her colleagues whenever they passed by, never letting anyone guess that behind those smiles was a storm of worries. Back in the CEO's office, Anderson flipped through the diary again. There was one entry where she had described watching her mother cough through the night, unable to afford proper treatment. Another page spoke of her dreams, to publish a book someday, to write words that could change lives. And then, there were the moments of loneliness, sitting at lunch tables alone, feeling invisible, convinced no one would ever truly see her. For reasons he couldn't explain, Anderson felt a lump in his throat. It was as if every sentence in that diary was pulling him back to a part of himself he had buried long ago. He too had once known the taste of helplessness, of wanting to scream but choosing silence instead. The thought struck him sharply. How many more Katreenas were there in his company? People smiling through pain, hiding behind their professional masks. He, the all-powerful CEO, had never cared to look. Anderson closed the diary slowly, his jaw tight with resolve. He needed to find this girl. He needed to know who she was. Not out of curiosity, but out of a sense of responsibility that burned in his chest. The last line echoed in his mind again and again, and he couldn't bear the thought of her walking home that night feeling unseen, unnoticed. That evening, when Katreena finally realized her diary was gone, panic rushed through her veins. She searched her handbag, her desk drawers, even the office hallways. Her heart dropped when she couldn't find it. She whispered to herself, trembling, "If anyone reads it, I won't survive the shame." Little did she know, the one person she feared the most, CEO Anderson, had already read every word, and his life, just like hers, would never be the same again. The next morning, Katreena entered the office with dark circles under her eyes. She had hardly slept. All night she tossed and turned, terrified about her missing diary. What if someone had picked it up? What if her colleagues discovered her? Secrets? Worse. What if the CEO himself found it? The very thought made her stomach twist with dread. As she sat at her desk, pretending to focus on spreadsheets, her eyes darted nervously around the office. She wanted to ask if anyone had seen a small diary, but fear kept her silent. Her life was already difficult enough. She couldn't bear to be pitied, or worse, mocked. Inside his corner office, Anderson had barely slept either. The words from that diary still echoed in his head. He had decided one thing. He couldn't just return it quietly. No. He wanted to meet the girl who had written those words. He wanted to look her in the eye and tell her she wasn't invisible. But there was a problem. The diary didn't have a name on the cover, and though the handwriting was delicate, it gave him no clear clue about who the writer was. Anderson, the man who could solve million-dollar problems, suddenly found himself struggling with something as simple as identifying an employee. That afternoon, during a team meeting, Anderson's sharp gaze scanned the room differently than usual. He wasn't looking at numbers or reports this time. He was searching faces. Which one of these people carried that much pain inside? His eyes paused for a moment on Katreena. She sat quietly, shoulders slightly hunched, her gaze lowered, as if trying to make herself invisible. For a flicker of a second, he wondered, could it be her? Meanwhile, Katreena's heartbeat raced. Anderson's gaze felt heavy, as though he could see right through her. She quickly shifted in her chair, gripping her pen tightly to hide the trembling in her hands. Later that day, when most employees had left, Anderson called his secretary. He handed her the diary and said in his usual commanding voice, "Find out who this belongs to." Discreetly. The secretary nodded, but inside, Anderson's heart was impatient. He didn't just want to return the diary. He wanted to understand. That evening, as Katreena prepared to leave the office, her handbag felt strangely empty without the diary. It had always been her secret companion, her silent listener. Without it, she felt exposed, as though a part of her soul was wandering in the open. She whispered to herself, "Please, let no one find it." But fate had already decided otherwise. The next morning, as she entered the building, The secretary approached her desk with a polite but firm smile. "Katreena, the CEO would like to see you in his office." Her blood ran cold. A chill spread through her body. She tried to steady her voice, asking softly, Did I do something wrong?" The secretary simply shook her head. "He'll explain." As Katreena followed the long corridor toward Anderson's office, her footsteps felt heavier with each step. Her mind screamed one thought over and over again. "Oh no. He found my diary." Katreena's palms were damp with sweat as she stood outside the CEO's office door. She could feel her knees trembling, her throat dry as if no words would come out, even if she tried. Taking a deep breath, she knocked gently. "Come in," Anderson's deep voice called. The door creaked open and she stepped inside. The office was enormous, lined with tall glass windows overlooking the city skyline. Anderson sat at his desk, his sharp gaze already fixed on her. He didn't look angry, but there was something in his eyes, a strange mix of curiosity and concern. "Sit down," he said firmly. Katreena obeyed, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to steady her breathing, but her mind raced with one thought: he knows, he's read everything. For a long moment, Anderson didn't speak. He simply opened the drawer beside him, pulled out the little diary, and placed it gently on the desk between them. Katreena's eyes widened, and all the blood drained from her face. She froze, unable to move, staring at the diary as though it were a dangerous weapon. "This belongs to you, doesn't it?" Anderson asked, his voice lower now, almost gentle. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Finally, with trembling hands, she nodded. "Yes, it's mine." Anderson leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "I read it." The words pierced through her like a blade. Her worst fear had come true. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "Please, give it back. I didn't mean for anyone to read it." But Anderson shook his head slightly. "Katreena, do you realize how powerful your words are? Do you know what I felt when I read the last line?" Her hands tightened around the edge of her chair, her body trembling. "It wasn't meant to be read. It was just my way of surviving." Anderson's gaze softened for the first time in years. "Surviving? You call this surviving? Writing about starving nights, your mother's illness, and believing no one notices you? Katreena, how could you carry all of this alone?" A tear slipped down her cheek. She lowered her head, ashamed. "Because no one cares. No one ever did. To everyone here, I'm just another assistant, invisible." Those words struck Anderson harder than she could imagine. For years, he had built walls around himself, hiding his own scars. Yet here sat a young woman, raw and vulnerable, admitting the very loneliness he had buried deep inside. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're wrong about one thing. Someone cares. I care. Because your words, they woke something in me I thought was long dead." Katreena blinked through her tears, startled by the sincerity in his tone. She had never seen the feared CEO like this, human, broken, almost fragile. But before she could respond, Anderson leaned forward again, his eyes locking with hers. "Katreena, I need you to promise me one thing. Never think your life doesn't matter again." Her heart skipped a beat. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen. Katreena sat frozen, her breath caught in her chest. She had expected anger, humiliation, maybe even the loss of her job. But not this, never this. The CEO, Anderson, the man who terrified the entire office, was speaking to her as though her life truly mattered. Her eyes flickered toward the diary lying on the desk between them. It suddenly felt heavier than ever, as if all her secrets were glowing under a spotlight. I didn't mean for anyone to know," she whispered, her voice trembling. That diary was the only place I could let it out. Anderson studied her for a long moment. Why didn't you ask for help? From anyone? Her lips quivered. Because when you're poor, asking for help feels like begging. And I promised myself I would never beg. I'd rather suffer in silence. The honesty in her words pierced through him. Anderson felt an ache in his chest, an ache he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Memories of his own childhood came flooding back. Nights when his father's anger left scars, mornings when he walked to school in torn shoes, the vow he once made that no one would ever see his weakness. He leaned back, exhaling deeply. You remind me of myself, more than you know. Katreena looked up at him in shock. The great Anderson, who everyone believed had a perfect life, was comparing himself to her. She couldn't believe it. Anderson continued, his voice lower. Now, I built this empire to protect myself from ever feeling powerless again. But in doing so, I forgot what it means to really see people. Your diary. He tapped the cover lightly with his finger. It reminded me of something I lost a long time ago. My humanity. Silence filled the office. The city buzzed beyond the glass walls, but inside, it was just the two of them. Two souls stripped bare of their masks. Katreena's tears fell freely. Now, not from shame, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being heard. I'm sorry you had to read it, she murmured. But, thank you, for not laughing at me. Anderson's expression softened further. Laugh at you? No, Katreena. I admire you. Do you know how much strength it takes to keep going, carrying all that weight alone? You're stronger than most people I know, including myself. Her chest tightened at his words. For years she had been invisible, overlooked, treated as though she were nothing more than a name on a payroll. But in this moment, the most powerful man in the company was telling her she mattered. And then, Anderson did something no one in the office could have imagined. He slid the diary across the desk toward her. This belongs to you, and I want you to keep writing in it. But this time, know that at least one person is reading, even if you never show it to me again. Katreena took the diary in her trembling hands, holding it close to her chest. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope spark inside her heart. That night, Katreena walked home with her diary clutched tightly against her chest. But unlike before, it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a shield. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. Someone had seen her, truly seen. Her, and it changed everything. At home, her mother noticed the subtle difference in her daughter's eyes. You look lighter today, she said softly, sipping the tea Katreena had prepared. Katreena smiled faintly. Maybe things are finally changing, Mama. Meanwhile, Anderson sat alone in his office long after everyone had gone home. The lights of the city glowed beneath him, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about that diary, about the young woman who had carried such heavy pain while smiling at the world. Something about her had broken through the walls he had built around himself for years. For the first time in a long time, Anderson realized that his success, his empire, his wealth, none of it mattered if he failed to recognize the humanity in the people around him. Katreena had taught him that without even meaning to. The following week, the entire office was shocked when Anderson announced new employee support initiatives, scholarship programs, healthcare coverage for families, and counseling services. People whispered in the hallways, astonished by the sudden change in their cold, distant CEO. None of them knew that it had all begun with one small, forgotten diary. As for Katreena, she continued her work quietly, but something inside her had shifted. Every time she passed Anderson in the hall, their eyes would meet for a brief second. There was no fear anymore, only a silent understanding, a connection that didn't need words. One evening, As she prepared to leave, Anderson called her into his office again. This time there was no tension, no fear. "I've been thinking," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You've got a gift, Katreena. The way you write, it's not ordinary. You don't just put words on paper. You make people feel, and the world needs that." She blinked, unsure how to respond. "But who would ever read what I write?" "I would," he said firmly. "And if I can, I'll make sure the rest of the world does too." Her heart skipped a beat. No one had ever believed in her before. No one had ever spoken those words to her. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of shame or fear. They were tears of hope. Anderson leaned forward, his voice steady. "Don't ever underestimate the power of your story, Katreena, because your words didn't just change you. They changed me." That night, as she walked home, the streets didn't feel as lonely anymore. She held her diary close, whispering a silent promise to herself. "I'll keep writing. Not just for me, but for everyone who feels unseen." And somewhere high above, in his office overlooking the city, Anderson looked out the window with the same thought in his heart. Two broken souls had crossed paths by accident, but in that accident, they had both found the beginning of healing.